This is 100 Years of Cocks.
I must wind up now. Duty calls me. Your affectionate sister, Vera.
That is really a priceless first-hand account of the 1908 games. Vera paints a very vivid picture, doesn't she? She really conjures up what it felt like to be sitting there, and her descriptions of the crowds. It's strange for us to think of crowds at the moment with our COVID restrictions and social distancing. And the way she describes the American fans with their rah, rah, rah shouts, and also the way that everyone's eyes were sort of focused on the entrance, which where the runners would come in, and then the agony they felt when poor Dorando came in tottering to and fro. And obviously they had wonderful seats. I mean, if they're right by the royal box. And what I found really interesting was her description of the way in which the crowd were informed of the progress of the race in advance of the runners' entrance into the stadium, with these men with megaphones and with these large boards with their numbers on, because they're quite well informed. They knew what was going to, who was in advance, who'd been leading through the race. It's incredible how they managed to communicate these things. And I loved her comment that every now and then, if you were lucky, you heard what they said. So details like that, are so often lost to history and only passed on through precious personal accounts, such as this one written by Vera. And the other thing is that the 1908 would have been, it would have been quite unrecognisable to us, because each of the runners was allowed a personal attendant on a bicycle. And he wore the same bib number as the runner, and there were a lot of motor cars and bicycles on the route with the athletes. And Dorando thought that had his bicycle attendant been allowed into the stadium with him for the final lap, he wouldn't have. He would have known which way to go, and he wouldn't have collapsed. And he was quite upset that the cyclist wasn't allowed in with him. But that's amazing, isn't it? The thought that they had their own personal cycle attendant.
Yeah, amazing. That's a glorious photo that you've got up there. There were loads and loads of crowds lining the route. It must have been an amazing spectacle. You can see I think they're wearing hats.
Look at that, they really are quite close to the athletes. The crowd were obviously lining the entire route, because if you see photographs from wherever they are on the route, there are crowds lining it. Just like today, the London Marathon, actually. There's no dull patch of the London Marathon. There are always crowds wherever you are around it.
But also, then there was no other entertainment. There was no radio. There was no TV.
They couldn't.
Yet, so there was no other entertainment to compete with it. This was happening today, and so everybody went to watch, I suppose, didn't they?
Yeah.
Right. So the other 8 siblings were very interested in Vera's account of the marathon race. So Bernard and Vera were the 2 who were in the stadium, and the others were all very interested in following the letters on in their stream. In the 1970s and 80s, the cousins, who continued the budget after all their parents had died, were equally interested in this marathon account. This letter of Vera's was one of the letters that was circulated around by the cousins and discussed as a notable example of why the family budget was so interesting. These are now some snippets from letters by the other siblings written in 1908, just after Vera wrote her marathon letter. So Avis wrote, "Vera, I thought your description of the marathon race most enthralling and exciting, but it gives me a feeling of horror. And though we have had an exciting discussion on its merits and the reverse, I still feel as if it were all wrong somehow. Enid, the other sister, she wrote, "Vera, your description of the marathon race is quite wonderful. It must have been quite ghastly to see, and I almost agree with Avis that there seems something quite wrong in it." Arthur wrote, "Vera's account of the marathon race is an epic, and it gives real distinction to the present budget." Cuthbert wrote, "I thought Vera's account of the marathon race was splendid. It doesn't seem to me as if enough account had been taken of the extraordinary heat of the day. Otherwise, I don't suppose they would have been nearly as exhausted. The Olympic Games have certainly not added to the reputation of the Americans as sportsmen. Yet, perhaps inconsistently, it doesn't seem as if people have been quite fair to Hayes, who, after all, was only a minute worse than Dorando in a 25-mile race and was quite justified in his protest." Meanwhile, poor Edmund, who's my great-grandfather, he'd been left out of this round of the budget, which was why Vera had the budget for 2 weeks. So it occurred to me that if Edmund hadn't not written his letter, and if he hadn't have been left out, he would have had the budget and Vera wouldn't have included this letter. So we've got to say thank you to Edmund for not writing your letter and being useless. So he left him out, which was why Vera had the budget for 2 weeks, which is why she wrote her letter. Strange way round of these. So Edmund is my great-grandfather. He's not my favourite sibling because he's a bit of a nightmare, actually, and I regularly roll my eyes over what he writes in his letters. So Edmund wrote in September 1908, "This writer would feel greatly honoured if permitted to peruse Vera's budget letter containing the account of the great marathon race, unless the letter has already been sent abroad."
Yeah, it might have been sent to one of the other brothers. Yes. Oh, poor Edmund. But I agree with them all. It's a fantastic, well written account. I mean, they are all very interested in sport, aren't they? That family, all the siblings. I mean, they play cricket. And of course, Vera's sportswoman par excellence, isn't she? With her hockey as well as beating all the boys with cricket. And I'm frequently amazed at how these Cox siblings managed to witness in person so many special occasions in the 20th century, such as that Zeppelin raid on the village of Hallam Fields in 1916, which Edmund witnessed, isn't it? And wrote about. In fact, I think I'm going to edit this family tree and put a little Zeppelin icon under Edmund's name and perhaps a hockey stick under Vera's name, and possibly a climbing rope on David's name.
Now, there's something I haven't told you. During lockdown, I found an online jewellery shop in Oxford, which had put some pictures up because it was in lockdown, and it was advertising an early 1900s silver hockey brooch, which was exactly how Vera describes the silver hockey brooch that she was presented for playing in the England team when she was an international. I doubt this hockey brooch is hers, but I think it's very likely it belonged to an England women's hockey player. So I found it online and I bought it. I haven't got it out here yet. My brother in Birmingham has got it at the moment. So when I get that, I'll have to show you that.
Oh, please do. That's amazing.
And there are actually more great occasions still to come in this podcast. The siblings were quite fascinating about the important things they went to witness. Bernard was very good at getting tickets. He was a stockbroker. He worked in the centre of London and he was quite wealthy because he was single and he had a good job. So he keeps on getting tickets to stuff and then he shouts his relatives and they all get a free ticket from him. So in 1910, several of the siblings watched the funeral procession of Edward VII in the centre of London. They had tickets in a private stand which had a restaurant below it, so they could go down and have lunch and then return to their seats. And they couldn't be bothered by the crowds of the general public, who of course weren't allowed into these private seats. So they describe the funeral procession in detail in budget letters, including the king's little dog who walked behind the gun carriage, which was carrying the coffin. So in this picture here, you can see all the people standing and lining up in the street. Well, my family didn't have to do that because they were a bit posh and they had money. So they had seats in a stand of seats, like you'd have in an Olympic stadium, where they had seats and they didn't have to line up with everybody like this. And so there you can see the king's horse. And if you look closely, you can see the boots are in backwards. and that was the culture that was the king's horse that was following. So the gun carriage will be just in front. Then you got the king's horse with the empty boots backwards, and then there's the king's little dog that followed all the way through. So the siblings talk about the king's little dog, and some of them say, I didn't see the dog. Was he there? How did I not notice when he walked straight past? So we've got that coming up in 1910. And then Bernard got tickets in another stand for the coronation procession. That was 1911, and that was George V. So that one gets described as well in letters. I think it was the official programme for the King's funeral in 1910, where the official programme was put into the budget. And this official programme has the list of all the names of all the European royals and the heads of state who attended the funeral, including the Kaiser from Germany. And then, of course, lots of them died in World War I. And after the war, one of the siblings has gone back to this old budget and the funeral programme, and they put notes against all the royal names. This one was assassinated, this one died, this one was deposed. It's an absolute fascinating record of all these royals and what happened to all of them in World War I. In the Bodleian Library, when I was reading all these and taking pictures, many times I accidentally squealed out loud at some new discovery, and people went shh, 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 and glared at me because I was being noisy, because you've got to be quiet in libraries.
Of course. Well, I very much look forward to those future episodes. It's a veritable cornucopia of early 20th century British history, not to mention what we're learning about what Aldwyn is doing in his mission in Malawi, and Neville's his experience in South Africa, and Wilfrid's adventures in Canada. There are many reasons, I think, why the 1908 Olympics was so important in the history of marathon running. In 1908, for the first time, there were judges from several different nations, not just from the host nation. And standard sporting rules were also established for the first time. The marathon was certainly the most memorable event of the 1908 Games. It caught the imagination of the press and the public, and the dramatic and controversial finish was covered in all the newspapers of the day across the world. And of course, the accepted distance for the modern marathon, 26 miles, 385 yards, was set at the 1908 Games. The official trial marathon was held on the 25th of April, 1908, and the start was 700 yards, 640 metres, from Queen Victoria's statue in Windsor on the Long Walk, beginning of the Long Walk, and the magnificent avenue that leads up to Windsor Castle that you can see here in Windsor Great Park. Now this old postcard it was posted in 1910, so just two years after the marathon. But of course, the view hasn't changed very much even since then. And shortly before the 1908 Games opened, it was realised that the royal entrance to the stadium couldn't be used by marathon runners because it involved a step up, because the royal entrance was designed to permit easy descent from the royal party out of their carriages. So they had to find an alternative way into the stadium for the athletes, and that was diagonally opposite the royal box. So that meant that the runners had to run clockwise round the running track. So that was the opposite to the normal way round, so that the crowd could have a good view of them, and that meant that the distance in the stadium was shortened from a full lap of the track to 385 yards. That's 352 metres. And from then on, the internationally recognised distance for a marathon became officially 26 miles and 385 yards. Now, in the late 1990s, my father, John Disley, accurately remeasured the first mile of the 1908 marathon in Windsor Great Park along this walk here. and he found that it was 174 yards, 159 meters short, meaning that the 1908 marathon distance was not actually 26 miles, 385 yards at all. And actually, he measured one or two marathons over the course of his career, which turned out to be on the short side. So any fast times had to be expunged from record books.
Wow. Okay. So in 1908, as Dorando entered the stadium, the crowd was hysterical with excitement, as Vera described. But the crowd was also very shocked. He was quite small. He was only 5'2" tall. He was wearing the number 19. He was dressed in crimson knickers with a crimson handkerchief tied round his head, and he looked like he was about to collapse. Vera described Dorando wearing crimson knickers, but they're not the same garment that women wear today. Men wore knickerbockers, which were knee-length trousers, which were often quite baggy, and they were generally worn with knee-length socks, although they were called stockings then. Men wore knickerbockers for sports. The word was then abbreviated to knickers, which were also worn by young children. Avis, in her letters, often talks about boys wearing a jumper and knickers, which is a very entertaining phrase for us to hear today. Vera says that the noise of the crowd was absolutely deafening, and then the crowd became silent as the people took in what an awful figure Dorando looked. He was dehydrated and confused, and it was reported that he initially tried to go around the track in the wrong direction.
Well, that's interesting because, as in the old, if you watch the old newsreel, Dorando, though he's clearly staggering badly, he doesn't appear to be going the wrong way. But there are several contemporary accounts which state that he started off in the wrong direction, which he attributed, of course, to the absence of his cycling attendant. The stewards were unsure what to do, but Dorando was clearly assisted, which was why he was disqualified. The official Olympic report stated that it was impossible to leave him there, for it looked as if he might die in the very presence of the Queen, because of course Queen Alexandra was present. I've been reading contemporary newspaper reports which suggest that many in the crowd actually thought that he had died.
I found an article written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the writer of the Sherlock Holmes stories, and he was also in the stadium as a spectator. That's my dog barking. He might have been sitting near Vera and Bernard, as he clearly had a good seat as well. In his autobiography, Conan Doyle wrote, "I do not often do journalistic work, but I was tempted chiefly by the offer of an excellent seat." Like Vera, Conan Doyle described the crowd cheering for Dorando, and then the huge collective groan each time as he collapsed. So this is Conan Doyle's article for the Daily Mail, and he said, "Out of the dark archway there staggered a little man with red running drawers, a tiny boy-like creature." And he continued, "He was within a few yards of my seat. Amid stooping figures and groping hands, I caught a glimpse of the haggard yellow face, the glazed and expressionless eyes, the lank dark hair streaked across the brow." So that was Conan Doyle's report. Dorando later said through an interpreter, "It was not until I saw the big stadium that the weakness came over me, and then, as I had no attendant, I became confused. If I'd had my attendant to guide me and give me such aid as I was entitled to, I could have finished without falling again, but they would not let my attendant come into the stadium with me." So Dorando fell 5 times as he headed for the tape, during which time both Hayes and then Hefferon entered the stadium behind him. Dorando eventually crossed the line, collapsed, and was put on a stretcher, whilst Johnny Hayes, the American, crossed the line second, and both of them were taken away by the ambulance. Reports of the American supporters in the stadium were not complimentary, but there'd also been a controversial finish in the 400-metre race, which then developed into a huge sporting row between the USA and the UK. American supporters were also unhappy that the Stars and Stripes flag had accidentally been omitted during the opening ceremony.
It's an extraordinary omission on the part of the organisers.
Indeed. A newspaper report from The Observer, which was written at the beginning of July, said, So this is before the marathon happened. Longboat of Canada was the favourite to win the marathon, and the report said he runs very fast and he runs very far. So I've no idea where Longboat came, but the newspapers obviously thought he was a favourite to win. The report said that the race was due to start at Windsor at 2:30 p.m. on Friday, 24th of July, and the leader would be expected in the stadium soon after 4:30. Vera wrote that Dorando didn't appear until 5:05, which is perhaps why the packed stadium was in such a state of excitement. Interestingly, the king didn't watch the marathon in the stadium, according to a newspaper report I found in The Guardian. This one was written on Saturday, July 25th. It said that the king was at an unnamed private engagement out of town. The Queen witnessed the finish of the marathon, accompanied by the Duke of Sparta and the Princess Victoria. And the next day, Bernard was in the stadium watching the results, and the Queen, as well as Princess Victoria and the Crown Prince and Princess of Sweden, were in the royal box for the medal ceremony. The king had provided sprigs of oak leaves taken from trees in Windsor Great Park for every winner, but he wasn't there to present them.
I'm asking myself what King Edward VII's private engagement might have been.
I know, no idea. So Bernard and Vera were watching the race, and their seats were close to the royal box, where they had a great view. The controversial marathon race was on the last day of the games. Bernard went to the closing ceremony the next day, where Queen Alexandra presented the medals and trophies. Dorando was there, having fully recovered. He was wearing a knickerbocker suit and a flat cap, and he got a hero's welcome from the crowd. He was awarded a cup by Queen Alexandra, her personal gift, and the cup still exists today, safe in a bank vault in Italy. And the inscription on the cup reads, "For Pietri Dorando, in remembrance of the marathon race, from Windsor to the stadium, July 24th, 1908, from Queen Alexandra." And of course, another of the Machel Cox siblings was there to give a first-hand description. And this is what Bernard wrote the day after. "Vera, your description of the marathon race is excellent, and I cannot add anything to it. It was certainly a pathetic sight, but so far was it from repelling me that it made one feel, even at the time that Pietri Dorando was staggering round the stadium, that to win a marathon race was surely one of the finest things in the world. The next day, I went to see the medals being awarded, and it was very curious to see Dorando, quite recovered, walking round the stadium as perky as possible. He was awarded a fine cup by the Queen. Of course, nobody expected to see the runners in such a state of collapse, and I'm quite certain that it added to nobody's pleasure, as some try to make out. I am told that Hayes was helped across Wormwood Scrubs before he entered the stadium, and that the protest on behalf of Hoffman would have been upheld if Heffron hadn't withdrawn it. Perhaps the protests might have gone considerably further, and the last man probably was the first." So that was what Bernard wrote. As I was researching this week, I found another 1908 report from the New York Times, and they declared, "It would be no exaggeration to say that the finish of the marathon at the 1908 Olympics in London was the most thrilling athletic event that has occurred since the marathon race in ancient Greece, where the victor fell at the goal and with a wave of triumph died." And then there's one more wonderful report. So this one's from the Times newspaper, and this is a newspaper report of what happened on the day of the ceremony. So this is the day after. "Suddenly, as the Queen was taking the medals from Lord Desborough and handing them to the winners, there was a great shout of 'Dorando!' And the man by whose name the marathon race of 1908 will always be remembered came out from the gangway under the competitors' stand, and he walked round the track by himself till he was joined by an Italian admirer bearing the national flag. It was a strange and moving contrast to the scene of the previous day. This little Italian confectioner, 24 hours ago, a pitiable, tottering, agonized wreck, looking like an old man on the brink of the grave, but now a quiet, self-possessed, sturdy young man, the hero of the multitude." A mighty roar went up from the whole assembly as he made his way to the tail end of the procession of prize winners, and the shouts and cheers and cries of applause and sympathy were renewed again and again. When it came to his turn to climb up the broad red-carpeted steps, placed almost exactly where he had fallen for the last time at the end of his gallant struggle, he received from the hands of the Queen the beautiful cup, her own personal gift. Then once more the cheering broke out as he walked round the rest of the course, holding his precious cup and waving the sprig of oak leaves with which, like the winners of the gold medals, he'd been presented by the King. And now the man who has been so signally honoured is to supply a music hall turn. Verily, we are a strange nation.
I think that's another lovely thing one gleans from Vera and Bernard's letters, and indeed the newspaper reports. The British love of the underdog. Dorando was clearly regarded as the hero of the hour, not Hayes, and it's Dorando whose name is remembered to this day. It was lovely that Queen Alexandra rewarded him with a special cup, possibly the only trophy ever awarded at an Olympic Games. I mean, thousands of Olympic gold medals have been awarded over the decades, but as far as I know, this is the only trophy ever awarded. And another thing that's worth noting is that before the 1908 marathon race, Johnny Hayes, who was Irish American, worked in New York's Bloomingdale department store, and Pietro Dorando was an Italian pastry chef. So they both had proper jobs, and they pursued their athletics as a hobby, essentially, albeit a serious one, but a hobby. Just as my parents in the 1940s and 50s had full-time careers when they were also being Olympic athletes, they were true amateurs. Now today, of course, athletes are sponsored so that they can devote themselves to their training, but these people did it in their spare time. Also worth noting that Dorando's winning time, actually his non-winning time, as it turned out, was just under 2 hours 55 minutes, whereas the world record today is, I think, something like 2 hours 1 minute, which just goes to show how much progress has been made in over, well, I suppose over a century. Another marathon race was actually run that same year in 1908 between Windsor and White City in 1908 and in October. And there were no fewer than, I think, 7 athletes who beat Dorando and Hayes' time. In fact, the winner's time was 2 hours 37 minutes. And the course on that occasion was measured at 26 miles, 586 yards. So it was, even in the year of the race, running times were getting faster. There is Dorando and Hayes in a newspaper drawing. They did very nicely, actually, by their famous rivalry. Both turned professional pretty quickly. Just 2 months after the 1908 marathon, Dorando travelled by ship from Southampton to New York, having been challenged to a rematch with Hayes, in which both men would get the share of the takings. This is an indoor race involving 262 laps around an indoor track in Madison Square Gardens, which would have been filled with tobacco smoke, and there was it was a huge crowd of both Italian supporters and Irish American ones. I'm sorry, I've lost my screen. Wait a moment. Bear with me. There you are. There were a lot of Italian supporters and a lot of Irish American ones. And Dorando won on that occasion, by only 75 yards, but he won. And the New York Times described it as the most spectacular foot race that New York has ever witnessed. But in 1909, there was another indoor marathon race at Madison Square Gardens again, and this time Dorando beat Hayes very easily. So the rivalry between these two men started a marathon craze in America, and in April 1909, a carefully selected field of the world's best long-distance runners ran at Polo Gardens in New York, and the prize was $5,000, which was a colossal amount in prize money in those days. 30,000 people, no less, cheered them on, and a Frenchman came first, and Dorando was second, and Johnny Hayes was third.
Wow. I find it fascinating reading today about what the athletes ate and drank and comparing it to today. The official 1908 Olympic report describes how the OXO company was the official caterer for the marathon. Competitors could drink both hot and cold OXO. They could have OXO and soda, and there was also rice pudding, raisins, bananas, and milk.
Actually, this reminds me of another one of my mother's 1948 reminiscences. She had grown up during the war. The Second World War broke out when she was 10. So she'd been brought up from the age of 10 with wartime rationing. And she said that it was a very balanced nutritional diet. And when she got into the British team, she was given extra rations. All the members of the British team were. And she said that was not good for her because she began to gain weight for the first time in her life. Anyway, modern athletes are recommended a high carbohydrate diet on the night before the race, so that they have plenty to burn off the next day. But most importantly, marathon runners are offered drinks of either water or high energy drink during the course of the race. Every mile in the London Marathon, they're offered these drinks, and the high energy drinks replace the salt that they are losing as they sweat. So this is why modern marathon runners don't usually collapse like Dorando did. So this is the 1948 Olympics. This is my mother's Olympics at Wembley, and this is the end of the marathon. And I'm showing this slide because even in 1948, runners could run into difficulties. And this is the marathon. My mother would have witnessed it at the first games in which she ran. The lead runner was a Belgian called Etienne Gailly, who was, like Dorando, the first to enter the stadium.
He's at him in 252.
Number 252, and he's clearly in a bad way. And the commentator described him as running almost in slow motion, or in a dream, I think the commentator said. And he was overtaken by an Argentinian runner, Cabrera, and then also by a British athlete, Tom Richards. And Cabrera won gold, and Richards won silver. But the guy managed to stagger over the line to secure a bronze medal. But note that the officials are taking no notice on this. Well, they're not ignoring him, but they're not trying to help him because they've learned their lesson. By this time, they knew that they couldn't step forward to help a struggling athlete.
The 1908 marathon in London followed a rural route from Windsor to White City. It went through all the villages along the way, including Eton, Slough, Pinner, Wormwood Scrubs and Wembley, with huge crowds lining the route. It must have been quite an event to watch.
Yeah, here they are. They're leaving Windsor Castle, or running past Windsor Castle, I should say. Much of the 1908 marathon would have been run through very picturesque parts of Berkshire, as well as through the London suburbs, and many of which were still villages in those days. And the route appears to have been lined with supporters all the way, as you see here. It's interesting to note that the route went past two major public schools, Eton and Harrow, where the boys would have been out in full. And it also went past the prison, Wormwood Scrubs, where the inmates probably weren't.
Interestingly, if you've ever been to BBC Television Centre at White City, that's where the former stadium was, which was purpose-built for the 1908 Olympics and the Franco-British exhibition which accompanied it. They all talk about going into the exhibition after they've been to the Olympics. The Olympic Stadium was demolished in the 1980s, and the BBC then developed the whole site. The famous donut-shaped TV studios have now been redeveloped into flats, but people of my age remember the old BBC studios with great affection. Emma, do you remember watching Roy Castle on the TV show Record Breakers? It was in 1977, and he and 500 tap dancers, all wearing white, broke the world record by dancing round the circular driveway of the BBC TV centre. I've just rewatched it. It's all on YouTube. It's quite delightful. I used to love watching Record Breakers. Or if you're a fan of Coldplay, they also played an open-air concert outside the BBC studios. And there are several videos of that online. And then they did a remake, I think.
I remember the Record Breakers very well, partly because it featured two friends of my parents again, former athletes turned sports journalists, Norris and Ross McWhirter. My mother was present in Oxford for the first 4-minute mile in 1954 because she knew that Roger Bannister was going to attempt to break the 4-minute barrier and was convinced he'd succeed on that occasion. And she herself wasn't running in that meeting because she had an Achilles tendon injury, so she wasn't running, but she made jolly sure that she was there so she could witness this occasion. And she well remembers Norris McWhirter announcing the result over the tannoy, with everyone waiting on tenterhooks, because of course no one knew. They'd watched the race, but no one knew whether he'd broken the record. So Norris McWhirter strung it out for as long as possible, and he very calmly and slowly announced the result of event 4, the mile. The winner was R.G. Bannister of Exeter and Merton colleges, in a time which, subject to ratification, is a track record, an English native record, a United Kingdom record, a European record, in a time of 3, and nobody heard anything more. Of course, the moment he said 3, of course, the 4-minute mile is broken nowadays in nearly every mile race.
Wow, what lovely. So many fascinating first-hand accounts. That's what makes history really interesting. Just before we finish, Emma, I've been reading ahead in the budget letters to see what comes next. And there's a subject coming up which I think will make you laugh, so I've really got to mention it. Hazel is the small daughter of Enid, who's the eldest sibling, and her husband Cyril, who's the schools inspector. And they live in Liverpool on Sefton Park Drive. And in 1909, it was Hazel's 9th birthday. Enid and Cyril had 2 children. Owen was the eldest. He was at Cambridge University when the First World War broke out. He signed up and he died in the trenches in France. But Hazel lived a very long life. And I know that her daughter-in-law and her grandson listen to this podcast. Well, for her upcoming birthday in August 1909, Hazel was pestering her mum because what she really wanted for a birthday present was a pair of stilts. And Enid writes all about it in her budget letter and says, I really don't know where I can buy some stilts from.
Oh, no. Yeah, stilts. Okay. I generally keep quiet about the stilts episode.
Okay, can we chat about stilts? Because this is another fascinating side to Emma Clearbury that people probably don't know about. In October 1909, Enid wrote in her next letter, Hazel is now very fond of her stilts and she can walk quite well on them, but she can hardly use them out of doors now as the ground is in a perpetual state of swamp owing to the persistent rain.
Okay, I'll tell you about the stilts. Because I did manage to use mine out in the rain in quite poor conditions. My father made me a pair of stilts when I was young, probably at about the same age that Hazel was when she received her pair. And in 1977, when I was 12, I climbed Snowdon on stilts for charity to raise money. There you are.
There you go. That's you. I'm amazed you can balance. You went up a mountain on those. I'd have no chance. How do you balance on them?
You just keep moving forwards. You can't stand still. You just have to propel yourself from one foot to the other. I've climbed Snowdon many times because my parents had a cottage in North Wales because my father is Welsh. And I spent lots of time in Snowdonia, and I had these stilts, and it seems, I don't know, we decided to put the two things together, and it took me 4 hours and 29 minutes, and I had press photographers there, and I was raising a lot of money for a charity, and I got into the Guinness Book of Records, which, of course, Norris McWhirters edited. So there you are. These things come around again. But anyway, I think that's quite enough of that episode of my life. Which
do you know there's a newspaper article online, because I found it. If you type in your name and stilts, there's a newspaper article as well.
Sorry, oh dear.
Enough of stilts. I've really enjoyed talking about marathons, although I'm not sure I'm actually capable of running one. I much prefer running 5 kilometres at parkrun, or if it's too hot, I just do a bit of a shuffle. Here in Queensland, we're very fortunate the parkrun is open again, and on Saturday, several koalas were spotted on our route. In the next podcast, Enid and her family, Arthur and his family, as well as several of the unmarried siblings, as well as Dr. and Mrs. Cox, are all on holiday. Some of them are staying in Branscombe in Devon, and some of them are just across the border in the neighbouring village of Charmouth in Dorset. And they're all there for the whole of August on holiday. So there are plenty of adventures, some bicycling, some bathing in the sea, as well as a grumpy landlady who's most particular about politeness at all times. 100 Years of Cox, the Machel Cox budget letters, and all content is subject to copyright and belongs to both myself and the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Emma, it's been great to have you on the podcast. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed it. Would you like to finish things off for us?
Thank you very much. It's been great fun. Thank you very much. And I look forward to listening to further adventures of the Machel Cox family. You have been listening to 100 Years of Cox. Thank you for listening.